and welcome to the Chess on Toast Game of the Day from the FIDE Candidates tournament. We're looking at round 7. My name's Nick Murphy. With me, as always, International Master Lorin D'Costa. So, Lorin, which game are we going to look at from round 7?
Hi there, Nick. Well, all games ended in a draw, but obviously some of the games were harder fought than others. And the game I'm going to pick today for round 7 was the game between Levon Aronian and Alexander Grischuk. Actually, we haven't featured Aronian in any of our videos yet, have we, Nick?
That's a bit of a travesty, isn't it? Because, I mean, he's one of the top players and he's joint leader at the moment.
I was going to say he's actually joint leader, so a bit of a travesty there. So here we go. Now, actually, you'd think, seeing he's the tournament leader, co with Carlsen, that he, would show one of his wins. But as we just said, all games ended in a draw.
But a draw doesn't necessarily mean a boring game, does it?
No, in fact, probably Aronian was a little bit lucky in this game. So whilst he may be leading, obviously every game they're playing top quality opposition.
Yeah.
So I think he was fairly lucky. So the game started with Aronian's kind of, believe it's like his favourite move, which is d4. Checking the database, this is the one he plays most. So even the top players have a preference more towards one opening than another one.
Yeah. And
Grischuk countered with knight f6. So rather than black playing d5 to control the e4 square, black does it with the knight, doesn't he? So that's pretty standard.
Yeah, makes sense.
c4, so this is the kind of the queen's gambit, and white attempts to play knight c3 followed by the pawn push, pawn to e4. So, pretty normal stuff. You control the centre, especially this e4 square here. And black played e6. So the idea of this is that if white now plays knight c3, which wasn't played, black gets to do what's called the Nimzo Indian, and the bishop pins the knight towards the king,
right,
and thus stops white playing e4, doesn't it? Because after e4, what could black do?
The knight could just take the pawn that's now on e4, and the white knight couldn't take back because it's pinned to the king.
Couldn't have said it any better. Well done. So that's the idea. I mean, there's lots and lots to that again. I mean, there's about 10 different replies that white can try here. But basically, essentially, it's all about this e4 square. And you're going to see the same thing occur in the game after the move knight to f3, where black responded with b6, and this is called the Queen's Indian defence,
right,
where black does the fianchetto of the bishop along here. And we've seen that before in Chess on Toast quite a lot, haven't we?
Yeah, it certainly occurs in quite a few of the games that we've covered, even in this recent tournament.
That's right, some of the earlier games we featured where white played g3 and bishop g2 to try and counter this. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. White now played g3, attempting to play bishop g2 to counter black's long bishop on b7. So when black went bishop b7, white played bishop g2. So again, both sides are really interested in that square on e4.
Is that fairly common then, when one person puts their bishop on a long diagonal, that the other person might put it on there to counterbalance it?
Well, in this position there are lots of moves. I actually play this myself. White's got a couple of moves. White can play knight c3.
Yeah.
White can even play the Kasparov variation a3,
wow,
which looks a little bit weird, but the idea is to stop black using the b4 square for the bishop. So, for example, after a3,
and if Kasparov played it, it's probably quite a reasonable move.
Well, for those who don't know who Garry Kasparov is, he's the was he world champion for over 20 years, so he's a pretty handy player. And now we see the point of a3 because it prevents black from playing bishop b4, doesn't it?
Yep.
So now, with the knight on c3, white can consider e4. So essentially, you could say that white's pawn on a3 helps white control the centre.
Wow, yes, it does make sense, but in a very sort of roundabout way, it actually does help him control the centre.
Exactly, and also another variation is to play e3, and the idea there is just to play bishop d3. Guess why?
To control that.
To control the e4 square. Yep. So
all different ways for sort of achieving the same objective.
That's right. But g3 is the most common one, especially amongst the top level chess. And black played bishop b7. Actually, my favourite move is to play bishop a6 here, and that leads to a slightly more complicated variation. Black's trying to attack the c pawn, and because white cannot defend it with his own bishop on f1, I mean, white's not likely to go e3 now, is he?
No.
To defend it. Bearing in mind that the bishop wants to go that way.
That's right, yeah. You've already sort of announced your intention to put the bishop on g2, haven't you?
That's right. So after, for example, b3, I mean, again, loads and loads of variations, but black can do something like c6, bishop g2, d5.
Yeah.
And black's trying to block the bishop in another way by using these pawns as like a stone wall defence.
We see time and time again that in these opening positions there's a lot of different good moves that you could play. There's no one definite best move, is there, quite often? No,
I mean, this has been seen in many different Grandmaster games and lower level games as well, so like my own. So g3 and black stuck to bishop b7. So bishop g2, bishop to e7. The point about white not playing the knight c3 move is that after bishop b4 check, white isn't going to go knight c3,
Right.
because this allows black to trade off and give white these double pawns.
Yeah.
Not saying black should do that. Again, black has the option.
Just a possibility.
Yeah. But white will probably do something like bishop d2. And again, if black swaps, white takes back and
is
tries
helping.
to control
Yeah.
e4. So here, queen c2 followed by e4. Again, it's all about that e4 square. Just from this position, I might just show that black could, of course, go d5. But then because he's blocked his own bishop on b7, white can now consider moves like knight e5, taking advantage of the fact that the bishop's not on it anymore.
Yeah.
So d5, black has to be a little bit careful. And in fact, in this position, we're threatening a very annoying check, queen a4. Because black's going to struggle to defend with something on this square or this square. So black should be very careful about this d5 move, basically.
Yeah.
Which is why Grischuk stuck to the modest bishop e7. And both sides castled. Now after knight c3, black could now go bishop b4. But the point is that he's wasted a move by playing bishop to e7, hasn't he?
Yeah, so
and then gone further.
We've talked about sort of moving pieces twice when you haven't completed your developments. Sometimes, quite often, it's not a very good idea, is it?
That's right, especially with these guys hanging back at home. So black could, of course, do that, but it's not really the best move. Just to show in this position, and again, without going into too much detail, the main line, or what was the main line, and I've played this a few times, it's quite popular at Grandmaster level and my level, is for white to play d5 here. Now, of course, black is attacking it 3 different times, and it's only defended twice. But the point is, after e takes d5, white now plays the surprising move knight h4.
Wow.
So black cannot now take because there is a pin, and because the pawn on e6 has moved in this direction, it now leaves that square f5 vacated, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So the knight on h4 now thinks that would be a pretty good square.
Ordinarily, you wouldn't want to put your knight on the edge of the board. The whole knight on the rim is dim, but that makes sense, doesn't it?
That's right, yeah, knights on the rim are normally dim. But here we see the reason why. It's actually got the f5 square there in yellow to come to. And also white would be interested to play knight c3 and eventually take that. So if I just show you, for example, if black goes d6, c takes d5, notice black hasn't got enough pieces on that anymore. Knight d7, knight c3. What does black do now? These pieces are all quite weak, and white's got knight f5, and he can start rolling these pawns forward. And does it look quite good for white now?
I would say, I mean, it looks, I probably prefer white in this position, I think.
Yeah, if you ask any sort of high-level player, they would definitely prefer white. Not only because we've got a space advantage, that means we've got more pieces up the board than our opponent has. Notice black is actually only not got a single piece past the third row, has he?
Right, yeah.
Whereas white's got a pawn on d5 with a knight and a couple of pawns, as we see there in the red arrows, coming forward.
Yeah.
So basically this is really, really strong for white. Of course, there's way more to it than that, because after knight h4, black can go c6. And then white has to sacrifice a pawn now. Takes, and then knight f5, bishop f6, e4. This is all completely crazy, and yeah, if the viewer's interested in this, you should just maybe put it on a board and have a look and see what you think, because white is a pawn up, pawn down, excuse me, but black's got this dud bishop on b7, and where's the knight on b8 going? If it goes to a6, is it going anywhere? So yeah, this is completely different. So I'm just showing that variation to explain the kind of possibilities for both sides in this position. But Aronian obviously, well, he knows that variation. I don't know him personally, but I know he knows that variation. But he instead played knight c3, and black's got to be quite careful that if he does something like d6, which is actually got a couple of pupils around 1800 level that play this move, but actually it's not that good, because white now plays d5 again.
Yes, yeah.
And after something like e5, then white can go e4 with that plan of knight h4, f5, f4.
And also completely blocking in that b7 bishop.
And what about the other one? It can't even move anywhere.
Wow, that's right, yeah.
So
of course,
black's got to be very careful about this position. Knight c3 is not without poison, because we're threatening to go d5. And again, if black goes d5, then white can go knight e5, pinning the bishop again. So black's actually under a little bit more pressure. Well, he's got to be a bit more careful. And Grischuk, of course, knows the best move, which is knight e4. Now, we did say don't move a piece more than once in the opening, but the trick is that black now wants to play a sort of Dutch defence with f5, which we actually saw in one of the earlier games between Rajabov and Ivanchuk, if you care to remember that one. Where black went f5 quite early.
I can't remember that long ago.
Well, the idea is f5 is to control the e4 square, isn't it?
Yeah.
So rather than block the bishop on b7. So the idea is that if white goes knight e5 now, Does it look like we have a winning pin on this square? This diagonal?
No, it doesn't, because that knight can move. Because, say, for instance, if it takes the other knight on c3, it's actually attacking the queen on d1, so white has to react to that threat. And, of course, now white's bishop can be taken.
That's right, and now black can start moving his pieces forward. And kicking white backwards, can't he?
Yeah.
So, after something like knight here, maybe white's got to be careful that black can't go c5, rook c8 and attack down on the c pawn. So
black's problem that we talked about earlier seem to be solved.
Yeah, because he's exchanged off a couple of pieces, he's actually reduced the pressure. That's actually quite an important thing, middle game strategy there. If you've got less space, you should actually try and swap off pieces, because if you see here, look, if black now had a bishop on b7 and a knight on f6, wouldn't he find it a little bit more cramped in his camp? Whereas now
there's more possibilities.
That's right, yeah. So after knight e4, white could take on e4, but then this allows bishop takes e4, and surprisingly enough, that bishop is very strong there, because white can't attack it with anything, can he?
No, of course.
I mean, he can move the knight, but guess what? White just gets his bishop exchanged off, and then d6.
Same again, yeah.
Well, it's pretty similar to what happens in the game, but you'll see that the position in the game was far better for white than what we see here. So bishop d2 was played. The idea just to defend the knight this way. Bishop f6. Black could have considered f5 again. Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, followed by bishop f6 and trying to exert pressure down here. Does that look okay?
I can't see any reason why not, no.
What do you think black's going to do about his knight on b8? How are we going to get that? Should we go to c6, do you think?
I don't think c6 is a good idea, because that's blocking his own bishop off. So maybe something like move the d pawn down to d6 and then bring the knight to that square.
Good, yeah, that's the best way. Or even though we say knights from the room are dim, we can go knight a6 and try and punt the c pawn forward with c5.
And maybe
try
bring the
and
knight to
capture
c7
yeah,
or
knight
c5.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, okay.
So knight a6 isn't a terrible move, but we don't really like to advocate knights on the rim here on Chess and
Unless
Toast,
there's a very good reason, we tend not to put knights on the rim.
That's right. So all in all, black went bishop f6, and here we saw knight e5. So how did you escape from that pin earlier?
Oh, I took the knight on c3.
Yep, good. Attacking the queen, so white has no time to capture the bishop on b7. And after bishop takes, of course, black swapped and king takes. So here, black needs to decide what to do. Well, do you think knight c6 is a good idea?
I don't like the idea now, because you could just take the knight and give black double pawns.
Are those good or bad double pawns, though? Or you're not sure?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. They have got sort of one friend on one side of them to help them, but
that's right. Double pawns generally are bad if there's an open file towards them, but there isn't here, is there? Because the pawn's in the way. Also, Nick mentioned the friend idea. Well, this pawn here, if that wasn't there on b6, then these would look quite weak, wouldn't they?
Yes.
So they're actually okay. The only thing is, after something like queen a4, black's got a little bit of a problem trying to defend this pawn.
Yeah. And
if white or black tries bishop takes d4, how can you see a tactic for white?
Something like dun dun dun. Oh, maybe yes. You could put the rook onto d1. Probably the rook on a1 to d1.
Good. Pinning and winning. So after c5, defending the pawn.
e3.
Bishop. e3. Excellent. Yeah. Now black's going to lose the bishop on d4. Well done. So queen a4. Yeah, it's probably not that good for black, is it really?
No.
So Grischuk decided to play c5. Well, he could have gone d6 as well. Not quite sure why he didn't do that, because white doesn't have here, does he?
No.
Seeing as the black knight protects it. So after knight f3, maybe knight d7, and again ideas of c5 or d5 pawn breaks. We've always talked about that before, haven't we?
We have indeed.
So it's quite surprising, I mean, at first glance, why he didn't do that. Just a quick look. No, I don't see what's wrong with that. But maybe he just thought c5 was much more attacking. So, and the point is, after takes on a c5, black can actually capture towards the centre. It's always a good idea to capture towards the centre. And now black might have a semi-open b file to attack down.
Yeah.
So white's not interested in trading a side pawn.
It's quite interesting that we've talked about developing your pieces, and here we are at move 11 already, and black still hasn't got that knight on b8 out.
But is it that bad for him?
I'm not saying it's bad, but we're always talking about developing your pieces, and that knight's stopping the rook on a8. I'm not saying that's a problem right now, but it's interesting that it's still not come out from the starting square.
Sure, but the thing about these top players is they know how to break the rules, don't they?
Yeah.
So black knows that there's no danger for him right here. And after what happened, knight f3, black took on d4. bishop takes. And again, he could have gone knight c6 here. The only thing is that allows bishop takes f6. And now he loses a pawn, doesn't he?
Yes.
Because b2 cannot be captured by the queen because the knight on c6 is hanging. So at the moment, after bishop takes d4, Grischuk took time out to even just go back. I mean, it seems a bit weird, doesn't it? He's gone bishop f6. And then he's kind of gone the other way again, wasted a lot of time.
Seems like wasting time.
But again, he's got this very solid position, hasn't he? Now this structure that happened here, it's got a name. Do you know what it's called?
I have no idea what that's called.
What's that animal that hibernates at? Right, I'm going to show my animal knowledge to like is very low.
Animal ignorance.
But there's an animal that curls up in a ball that has spikes.
The porcupine?
Nearly, a hedgehog.
Hedgehog, right. Okay.
And the reason why this setup's called the hedgehog setup is because black kind of curls up in a ball. Notice again, black is not past the third rank. But as you're going to see in the game, hedgehogs have the ability to kind of uncurl and prick you.
Right, okay.
So here we're going to see black actually get a bit of a dangerous initiative, and Aronian actually has to spend a bit of time dealing with that, which is quite unusual, isn't it? Because black seems to be in...
At the moment, this looks like a very quiet game.
Yeah. So, queen c3, I mean, of course, white had loads of sensible moves like rook d1, rook c1, b4, I don't know. But instead, queen c3, trying to take advantage of this idea. So, e5. Now, I really didn't like that move, but it forces here, now black gets developed. And look what happens here, black suddenly gets a bit of initiative, and now, f5. So, Grischuk thinks, well, I've had enough of all that, let's get going. And he's trying to get a bit of a kingside action like this.
As you say, suddenly from what looked like quite a quiet position, now this looks like quite an attacking, sharp position.
Yeah, and white can't really stop this one, can he? He can't really stop f4 coming. And he's not really likely to capture that, is he? Because he'd then weaken his own kingside.
Yes, yeah.
So he decided to play on the queen side with b4, king h8. And again, he just now thought, well, if I don't do anything, black's going to get these pawns going. So he played a very risky move, c5. Now, yeah, what do you think of that? I mean, it seems to walk into this,
yeah, exactly.
doesn't it?
I would never ever consider that, simply because it looks like you're about to unleash a discovered attack on your own queen.
Yeah, it's quite dangerous, but maybe Aronian thought he didn't have anything else. I mean, for example, if I go knight d2, then f4 looks quite strong, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And black's getting a bit of play. Or black can consider this kind of Grand Prix attack idea of bringing a queen round. So that, and then maybe knight f6, and maybe knight g4. So maybe Aronian thought, if I don't do something here, I'm actually going to be just sitting here doing nothing. So he played this risky move c5, and black took with the b pawn, and then b takes, knight takes a... well, actually threw in this one. He could go knight takes c5, but now we see white's trick with knight takes e5. Although black can now go bishop f6. Actually, I've got completely no idea what's going on in this position. Maybe the tactics start reining in here, because after this, I think white can play queen takes c5, sacrificing his queen, but winning the queen back.
Yep.
Which way should black capture?
I'd definitely take with the rook.
Are you sure?
Oh, no. I mean, when I say definitely, I mean I definitely wouldn't.
You definitely wouldn't, yeah, bishop takes.
You just didn't let me finish my sentence there.
And then white wins the pawn. So maybe this was Aronian's idea, to try and just open up the lines towards...
So white ends up with a pawn advantage.
Yeah, exactly. It's turned around now, hasn't it? So after b takes c5, Grischuk chucked an e4 first. And now this is the problem for white. He can't take that because his queen's hanging. So he moved the knight, and now black played knight takes c5. And now it's a question of whether white has compensation here, because although black's now not threatening this idea, what he is a pawn up, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he's got a nice centre pawn. So the game is roughly equal. It seems as though Aronian now spends the rest of the game just trying to equalise here. Knight b5. Could black now go knight d3, which looks like a very tricky move, because it attacks the queen and threatens knight takes c1.
I can't...
Well, if you just move the queen away, you lose the rook, don't you?
Yeah.
So the idea is actually that white can play queen takes c8. It's quite difficult tactics, isn't it?
But then the queen...
Yep, and then rook takes.
Rook takes.
Well, the position's equal now on pieces, but now...
Wow,
the knight gets lost. So the knight put itself, what we say, on pre, didn't it?
Yeah.
So knight, that can't be played. So queen b6, attacking the knight, queen c4, and now both sides manoeuvre around. Black went back to what he was faced with this threat of knight d5. Do you think white's got what we call compensation, Nick? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly looks as though
He's for a pawn. He's a pawn down, remember? So he swaps pieces off. I mean, basically, black remains a pawn up, but I think white's activity.
When you're a pawn down, though, it's not always a good idea to swap pieces off, is it?
No, but what he's done is he's swapped off all of black's good pieces and left black with 3 not that active pieces.
Yeah.
So I think black's basically fine, but what the game is, it ends in a draw because white manages to win the pawn back, as we see in the game. Well, it looks like black gets a bit of an attack, but really everything's covered here because black's queen is over there and not hanging around these guys over here. So bishop f6, and now white wins the pawn back, and I think black now goes into I'm going to swap everything off and draw. So as we see here, the pieces come off, and we get this sort of very level endgame. And now white played bishop b6 and offered a draw. I think the idea is that now the rook can capture the pawn, and we get this completely level rook ending.
Yeah.
So Aronian as white had enough to draw for the pawn, but he was never really looking like he was going to win. So quite well played by Grischuk as black, although not the exciting bloodfest that we were hoping for. I think a draw at the top level is a fairly good result, and Grischuk will be happy. Probably Aronian would kick himself that he didn't really get enough out of that opening. But for the club player, I think that's hopefully demonstrate a bit more about this hedgehog system and also the Queen's Indian. Yeah,
some really interesting stuff. Like I said at the very beginning of this video, a draw doesn't necessarily mean a boring game, as we've seen here. Well, thanks for that, Lorin, and we'll see you very shortly for round 8.